When I got married, I didn't mention I inherited 4 houses from my dead mother. And trust me, I've never been more grateful for keeping that secret. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I met Daniel Brooks at a friend's barbecue 2 summers ago. He was the kind of man who knew how to make everyone laugh, confident but not arrogant, or so I thought. I was a nurse working long shifts, living a quiet life in Austin. My mom had passed away 2 years earlier, and losing her changed something inside me. She left me 4 houses, small rental properties she had worked her whole life to pay off. It was a lot, more than I could ever need, but I never told anyone about it, not even Daniel. I wanted to be sure whoever I married loved me for who I was, not what I owned. When Daniel and I started dating, everything felt easy. He'd show up outside my workplace with coffee, surprise me with little notes, and talk about our future like it was already written in the stars. He told me about his struggles, how his contracting business wasn't doing great, but he was determined to build something of his own. I admired that. It made me want to support him, not because of his success, but because of his drive. When we got married, it was small and simple, just close friends and a few relatives. I wore a dress I bought on sale, and Daniel said I looked like a dream. For a while, I believed that everything was perfect. We rented a cozy house on the outskirts of town. I worked extra shifts, and Daniel picked up small renovation jobs. We were building a life together, or at least that's what I thought. Slowly, things began to change. At first, it was little comments. He'd ask why I didn't push for higher pay, or why I didn't dream bigger. He'd tease me about not knowing how hard it is to run a real business. It sounded like jokes, but there was a sting behind them. He started caring more about appearances, what car we drove, where we went out, how people saw us. One evening, I mentioned maybe saving for a down payment on a better place. He laughed and said, "You think we can afford that? You're cute." Something in me tightened. I didn't tell him I could buy 10 houses if I wanted to. I just smiled and said maybe someday. As time went on, Daniel became more demanding about money. He'd question every expense, even small ones. If I bought a new pair of shoes, he'd roll his eyes and talk about financial responsibility. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about control. I tried to brush it off, telling myself marriage takes patience. But deep down, I started to wonder who I had really married. And though I didn't say it out loud, a quiet voice inside me whispered that my mother's gift. It didn't take long for things to change after the wedding. At first, it was small, almost unnoticeable things. Daniel started paying too much attention to how I spent money. If I came home with groceries, he'd go through the bags, checking prices and shaking his head at what he thought was waste. I used to think he was just being careful, but it slowly turned into something more. One evening, I bought a small cake for us after a long shift at work. I thought it would be a nice treat, but when he saw the price tag, he frowned and said, "You really think we need to waste money on that?" The way he said it wasn't about the cake, it was about control. I felt embarrassed and small, like I had done something wrong just for trying to bring a little joy into our home. He started making jokes about my car too, calling it that tiny nurse wagon. He'd laugh and say things like, "You should be lucky I'm not the kind of guy who cares about money. Some men wouldn't even look at you driving that." I'd laugh weakly, pretending it didn't bother me, but each comment chipped away at me. I noticed he liked talking about people who had money, especially women. If he heard about someone's wife inheriting property or marrying into wealth, he'd smirk and say, "Now that's a smart woman. She knows how to live easy." He'd always follow it up with something like, "Not that I care about that stuff," but I could hear the bitterness in his voice. He'd tell me about rich couples in his line of work, how those people know how to do life right. I started realizing how much he valued money, how he almost worshipped it. And every time he brought it up, a quiet wave of relief ran through me. I was so thankful he didn't know about the houses my mom left me. There was a moment that still sticks with me. We were driving home from a dinner with one of his friends, and Daniel started talking about how much the friend's wife's family was worth. "Imagine marrying into that kind of money," he said, almost to himself. Then he looked at me and added, "Don't get me wrong, babe. I married for love, but a little comfort wouldn't hurt." I smiled tightly, staring out the window, holding my tongue. At night, while he slept beside me, I'd lie awake and think about how different he had become. He used to hold my hand and tell me we could conquer anything together. Now, it felt like all he saw was what I didn't have, or what he thought I didn't have. Something inside me began to grow quiet. I stopped sharing little joys, stopped asking for things. I kept my words small, my steps careful. But deep down, I also started to protect something, my secret. Something in my gut told me to keep it hidden, to guard it like my life depended on it. And the longer I watched Daniel's true nature show, the more I knew that voice was right. Secret I'd kept might be the only thing that would save me later. In front of everyone, Daniel was the kind of husband people admired. He'd show up at family dinners with flowers in his hand, pull out my chair, and wrap his arm around me like I was his whole world. He'd compliment me in front of his friends, calling me the best thing that ever happened to him. People would smile and say I was lucky to have such a thoughtful man. I used to believe it too, but those moments had started to feel like scenes from a play, something he performed, not something he felt. When the door closed and it was just the two of us, everything changed. His voice would turn cold, his eyes distant. The man who laughed with me in front of others became someone who barely looked at me. He'd spend hours scrolling through his phone or pretending to work on his laptop. If I tried to start a conversation, he'd sigh or say he was too tired. I kept trying to fix things, cooking his favorite meals, asking about his day, but nothing seemed to matter. He only came alive when someone else was watching. One night, I came home early from my shift at the hospital. As I walked up the driveway, I heard Daniel talking on the phone. His voice was low, but I could tell he didn't know I was there. I paused by the kitchen door, and what I heard made my stomach twist. He was talking to his brother, saying he deserved better than struggling with a broke nurse. He laughed as he said it, like it was some kind of joke. I stood there frozen. It felt like someone had punched the air out of me. I wanted to burst in and ask him what he meant, but I didn't. Instead, I walked quietly back outside, sat in the car for a few minutes, and stared at nothing. That sentence kept echoing in my mind, a broke nurse. So that's how he saw me. Not as his wife, not as someone who stood beside him, but as someone beneath him. When I went back inside, he was already off the phone, smiling like nothing had happened. He asked me how work was, kissed my cheek, and said he'd been missing me. I smiled back, pretending everything was fine. My heart was breaking, but I wasn't going to show him that. That night, as he slept, I looked at him and made myself a quiet promise. I wouldn't let him see me weak again. From that moment, I started observing him closely. The way he changed his tone depending on who he was talking to. The fake smiles, the sudden kindness when someone new was around. I realized every word he said in public was calculated. So I decided to test him. I wanted to see how far he would go if he truly believed I had nothing. I stopped offering to pay for little things, stopped talking about money altogether. I wanted to see what he would do when he thought there was nothing to gain. And in my heart, It started with little comments that didn't seem like much at first. Daniel began talking about how we should declutter the house, saying it was time to let go of old things. Most of the items he pointed at were things that had belonged to my mother, her paintings, her dishes, even a small rocking chair she used to sit in. One evening, he looked around the living room and said, "We should sell some of this stuff. It's just taking up space." I froze for a moment. Those weren't just things to me. They were pieces of her, pieces of my childhood. I told him gently that I wanted to keep them, that they reminded me of her. His face hardened, and he sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Emily," he said, "you can't live in the past forever. It's just clutter. We could use the extra cash." I told him no. That's when the argument started. He accused me of being sentimental and childish, saying I was holding on to junk. I tried to explain that it wasn't about money, but he just shook his head and walked away. From that day, something in our home shifted. There was no warmth anymore, just silence and tension. Daniel started staying out later than usual. He said he had extra work projects and that his business was finally picking up. I wanted to believe him, but things didn't add up. He'd come home after midnight, smelling like expensive cologne I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, he said he'd stopped for drinks with clients. His answers were always short, always defensive. One afternoon, while paying bills, I noticed strange charges on our shared credit card. Restaurants we'd never been to, hotel bars, and expensive gifts. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the list. I didn't say anything to him right away. I just sat there, staring at the screen, realizing that I was no longer confused. I was starting to see him for who he really was. I told my best friend Sarah about it over coffee a few days later. She frowned and said, "Emily, something's not right. You should look into it." She even offered to help me go through the charges or hire someone to check. But I shook my head. I told her I didn't want to jump to conclusions, even though deep down, I already had them. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every word he had ever said started replaying in my mind. Every insult, every fake smile, every time he called my mother's things clutter. It all started to fit together like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to see before. I could have confronted him right then. I could have shouted, demanded answers. But instead, I decided to stay quiet. I wanted to know how far he would go if I didn't stop him. I didn't want to just react. I wanted to understand. So I started watching him closely, letting him think he was still in control. He didn't know it yet, but his lies were slowly building the trap he'd one day fall into. Already knew, whatever mask he was wearing wouldn't last much longer. I wanted to see who Daniel really was when there was nothing for him to gain, so I came up with a plan. One evening over dinner, I told him that the hospital had made budget cuts and I'd lost my job. I said it softly, pretending to be embarrassed and scared. I expected him to comfort me, to say we'd figure things out together. Instead, he just stared at me for a few seconds, then sighed loudly. "You're kidding, right?" he said. When I shook my head, he pushed his plate away and muttered, "Unbelievable." The rest of the night was quiet. He didn't ask if I was okay or what my next steps were. Instead, he complained that we'd fall behind on bills and that my timing couldn't be worse. The next day, he started acting colder. If I tried to talk, he'd give short answers. When I mentioned maybe picking up part-time work, he said, "Yeah, maybe you should actually contribute for once." It shocked me how quickly his kindness disappeared. A few days later, I overheard him on the phone again. He was talking to someone, probably his brother, and said, "I don't know how long I can keep dealing with her. She's got nothing going on now. Maybe she should just move in with her dead mom since she's so useless." The words hit me like ice. I stood there in the hallway now. He didn't even lower his voice. He didn't care if I heard. That night, I packed a small bag. I didn't tell him where I was going. I just said I needed space to think. He barely looked up from his phone and muttered, "Whatever, do what you want." I drove for almost 2 hours until I reached one of my mother's houses, a quiet lakefront property she had loved. It had always been my favorite, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of water against the dock. When I got there, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like cedar and memories. I sat on the floor, still in my work clothes, and cried until there were no tears left. It wasn't just the words he said, it was what they meant. Everything between us had been a lie. I realized that the man I married never loved me. He loved the version of me he thought he could control. As the night grew darker, I sat by the window watching the reflection of the moon on the water. I thought about my mom and how she always told me to trust my instinct. I finally understood why I had kept my inheritance a secret. Something inside me must have known this day would come. By the time the sun began to rise, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to cry over him anymore. I wasn't going to beg for love from someone who didn't have any to give. He wanted a woman he could use, not a partner. And now A few days after I left for the lake house, Daniel started texting me like nothing had happened. His messages were short and polite, pretending to care about how I was doing. I replied the same way, calm and distant. I didn't want him to know that I was already watching him closely. Something told me he wasn't just angry or frustrated, he was hiding something. One evening, while checking our shared email for bills, I noticed a strange notification from one of his social accounts. It was a message from a woman named Madison. Curiosity turned into dread as I clicked through and saw their chat history. My hands shook as I read the messages. He was telling her how unhappy he was, calling me a burden, and saying he was done with his broke wife soon. He even joked about how he deserved someone who knew how to live better. There were photos too, pictures of Madison posing with jewelry and handbags I had seen charges for on our credit card. The same odd expenses I'd noticed earlier now had faces. My stomach twisted when I realized every gift he gave her was bought with my money. I sat there frozen, scrolling through messages that tore away the last bit of hope I had for our marriage. But instead of confronting him, I took screenshots of everything. Every message, every picture, every transaction. I saved them all in a hidden folder. I wanted proof, not emotion. The old me would have cried or begged for an explanation. But this time I stayed calm. I wasn't going to let anger control me. I was going to let the truth destroy him slowly, on my terms. When he called that night, I answered as if nothing had changed. He said he was working late again, and I pretended to believe him. I even told him I missed him, just to keep him comfortable. He laughed and said we'd talk when things settled down. His tone was relaxed, confident. He thought he was untouchable. Over the next few days, I followed Madison's social posts quietly. She seemed proud to show off the things he bought her, bracelets, perfume, even a watch I had gifted him for his birthday. Seeing her wearing it made my chest ache, but I didn't let myself break. Each post only made my resolve stronger. It became clear that Daniel never saw me as a partner. I was just a safety net, a quiet woman who worked hard and didn't ask too many questions. But he had underestimated me. He thought I was weak because I stayed silent. What he didn't know was that silence can be a weapon when used at the right time. I spent the next few nights at the lake house planning what to do. I didn't want to just walk away and let him enjoy his new life. I wanted to make sure that when I was done, he would remember me, not as the woman he betrayed, but as the one who outsmarted him, the one he'd regret losing for the rest of his life. First time in a long time, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. A week later, I decided to go back home. I had cried enough, planned enough, and now it was time to act. I called Daniel and told him I wanted to try again, that maybe we could fix things if we both tried harder. He sounded surprised at first, then quickly agreed. His voice had that fake warmth again, the one he used when he thought he was winning. When I walked into the house, he greeted me with a smile, acting like nothing bad had ever happened between us. He hugged me tightly, called me babe, and said he'd missed me. I let him believe it. I smiled, cooked dinner, and asked about his work. I was calm and gentle, playing the role of a forgiving wife. Inside, I felt nothing but cold focus. After a few days, I brought up money. I told him that since I wasn't working anymore, I had been thinking about selling some of my mom's old jewelry to cover our bills. The moment I said it, his eyes lit up. He tried to hide it, but I saw it. He leaned forward and said, "That might actually be smart. I could even help you find someone who'd pay a good price." I pretended to think about it, nodding slowly. "That would be great," I said. "I just want to get through the next few months until I find another job." He smiled, kissed my forehead, and told me not to worry, that he'd handle it. In that moment, I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. What he didn't know was that, while I was pretending to rely on him, I was meeting with a lawyer behind his back. My lawyer was calm and professional, but when I told her everything, about the cheating, the lies, the secret inheritance, she looked at me with quiet respect. "You're doing the right thing," she said. Together, we worked on paperwork to protect everything my mother had left me. I transferred the deeds of all 4 houses into a trust under my mother's name. It meant Daniel would never have any legal claim to them, not even if we were still married when I filed for divorce. I signed every document carefully, feeling stronger with each stroke of the pen. Back at home, I played along like nothing was happening. I let Daniel think I was still fragile and grateful for his support. He'd call people and brag about how he was helping me manage things, how he was taking care of his wife. I'd smile and thank him in front of others, pretending I believed every word. But when I was alone, I'd look at the stack of signed documents hidden in my drawer and feel a calm I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't powerless anymore. I was no longer waiting for him to change. I was preparing to leave, but not before he saw exactly what it felt like to lose everything he thought he controlled. Daniel had built his life on lies and greed. Soon he'd. A few weeks later, I told Daniel I wanted to throw a small dinner for his birthday. I said I wanted both of our families there to celebrate, to start fresh. He looked surprised but happy, thinking I was finally coming around. "That's my girl," he said, smiling wide. He had no idea what was coming. I spent the whole week planning everything. I cooked his favorite meal, set the table beautifully, and even bought him a new shirt to wear. He was in a great mood that night, laughing loudly, talking about how lucky he was to have such a caring wife. Both of our families were there, chatting and smiling, unaware that the air in the room was about to change completely. As everyone ate, Daniel started bragging about his work and the big opportunities he had coming. He made a few jokes at my expense, light ones, but enough for me to feel the sting. I smiled through it, waiting for the right moment. After dinner, when everyone was relaxed, I stood up from my chair and looked around the table. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding hard inside my chest. "I'd like to say something," I began, my voice calm. The room quieted down. Daniel looked at me, still smiling, not knowing he was seconds away from losing everything. "First of all, happy birthday, Daniel. I really did want to make tonight special. But there's something I need everyone here to know, something I've been keeping to myself for a while." I turned to him. "I know about Madison." The smile dropped from his face instantly. The room went completely silent. "I know about the messages, the late nights, and the gifts you bought with my money. I've seen everything." His mother gasped, and my father-in-law's fork fell onto the table. Daniel's face went pale as he opened his mouth, trying to speak, but no words came out. I took a small folder from my bag and placed it on the table. "These," I said, "are copies of every message, every receipt, and every charge. I thought you might like to see what your definition of love looks like on paper." He looked at the folder but didn't touch it. His hands were shaking. Then I took a deep breath and said the part that ended everything. "I also want you to know that I've already filed for divorce. And before you start thinking about what you might get out of it, don't bother. Every property, every dollar, and every asset you thought you'd get from me was never yours to begin with. Everything my mother left me is protected under her name, far from your reach." Daniel looked like he'd seen a ghost. His family just sat there, stunned, no one saying a word. He tried to speak again, but I didn't let him. I slid an envelope across the table, the divorce papers. "You can have these instead," I said quietly. I looked around one last time, then pushed my chair back. My legs felt weak, but my head was held high. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, but I didn't look back. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. My heart was shaking, but it was beating for me again, and that was enough. Learn that the woman he underestimated had been 2 steps ahead all along. After that dinner, everything changed. Daniel's family could not believe what they had heard. His mother, who once defended him in every argument, refused to even look at him. His father called him a disgrace, saying he had shamed the family. His siblings stopped talking to him altogether. The truth had spread quickly, and everyone now knew who he really was. The man who once tried to control everything suddenly had nothing left to control. Madison disappeared almost immediately after the dinner. As soon as she found out Daniel had no money and no future to offer, she blocked him and deleted every trace of him from her life. The expensive gifts she used to post pictures of were gone, and so was her fake love. Daniel tried reaching out to her, but she didn't respond. He had built his whole world on lies, and one by one, those lies collapsed around him. A few days later, Daniel tried calling me. First it was one message, then 10, then dozens. He begged for forgiveness, saying he didn't mean to hurt me, that he was just stressed and confused. He said he wanted to start fresh, that we could make things right. But I didn't reply. I blocked his number, his emails, and every way he could reach me. For the first time, his silence didn't scare me. It gave me peace. I was finally free of his voice, his control, and his endless manipulation. I spent the next few weeks focusing on myself. I went back to work, took long walks, and started sleeping better. I visited the lake house where I had cried months ago, but this time, it felt different. The air was calm, the water still. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and realized I didn't feel angry anymore, just relieved. I had survived something heavy, and I had done it quietly on my own terms. With the help of my lawyer, I began renting out the other houses I owned. I made sure each one was well taken care of, exactly how my mother would have wanted. The income helped me rebuild my savings, but more than that, it reminded me of my strength. Every time I signed a rental agreement, I felt a small wave of pride, because those homes were safe. No one could ever take them away. People in town still saw me smiling and polite, never guessing the storm I had come through. I didn't need to explain. The world didn't know my story, and I didn't want it to. I had learned that peace doesn't come from shouting your pain. It comes from quietly protecting what matters. Sometimes, when I drive past one of my mother's houses, I slow down for a moment. I look at the garden, the lights in the windows, the small signs of life returning. It always makes me smile. Daniel might have thought he could use me, but in the end, I walked away with everything that truly. Months had passed since everything ended, and life had finally begun to feel calm again. Emily sat on the porch of her lake house one quiet morning, holding a warm cup of coffee in her hands. The sun was rising over the water, painting everything in soft gold. The same place where she had once cried and felt broken now felt peaceful and safe. She watched the gentle ripples on the lake and breathed in the cool air, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, contentment. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt comforting, like a friend who had been waiting for her to come back. For so long, she had blamed herself for keeping her inheritance a secret. She used to think that hiding it made her dishonest. But now, she understood it differently. It wasn't deceit. It was survival. If she had told Daniel about those houses, he would have used them, twisted them, and maybe even taken them. Keeping quiet had been her way of protecting herself and what her mother had left behind. She thought about her mother often. Every corner of the house reminded her of her kindness, her strength, and her quiet wisdom. Her mother always said, "Not every truth needs to be spoken, especially to those who won't honor it." Back then, Emily hadn't really understood what that meant. Now she did. Her mother's legacy wasn't just about the 4 houses or the money they brought. It was about resilience, independence, and knowing when silence was strength. Emily opened the windows and let the morning breeze fill the room. The scent of pine trees mixed with fresh air drifted in. She felt light, almost weightless. She didn't need anyone to validate her choices anymore. She had made it through heartbreak, betrayal, and loneliness, and come out stronger. The pain had changed her, but it hadn't hardened her heart. It had only made her wiser. Sometimes, when she looked back, she could still hear Daniel's voice, his lies, his empty promises, but they no longer had power over her. He was just a chapter she had finished reading. What mattered now was the new one she was writing, quietly and steadily, with peace as her main goal. She whispered softly, almost like speaking to her mother. Sometimes silence isn't hiding. It's protecting the peace you'll one day need to rebuild your life. The words felt right, like a truth she had carried all along, but never said out loud. As the morning sun climbed higher, she smiled. She didn't need revenge or closure from anyone else. She already had it. Her strength, her freedom, and her mother's love had carried her through. The 4 houses stood as a reminder, not of wealth, but of wisdom. Emily took another sip of her coffee and closed her eyes, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in years, she felt completely free, grateful not only for what her mother left behind, but for the strength she had discovered within herself. Mattered, my mother's legacy, my dignity, and my peace.